Alright, guys, so let's continue with The Painted Bird, Chapter 7. The Painted Bird. Drink some of this coffee. So, Chapter 7, The Painted Bird. The village lay far from the railroad line and river. 3 times a year, detachments of German soldiers would arrive to collect the foodstuffs and materials which the peasants were obliged to provide for the army. I was being kept by a blacksmith who was also the head peasant of the village. He was well respected and esteemed by the villagers. For this reason I was better treated here. However, now and then when they had been drinking, the peasants would say that I could only bring misfortune to the community, and that the Germans, if they found out about the gypsies' brat, would punish the entire village. But no one dared to say such things directly to the blacksmith's face, and in general I was not bothered. True, the blacksmith liked to slap my face sometimes when he was tipsy, and I got in his way, but there were no other consequences. The 2 hired hands preferred to thrash each other rather than me, and the blacksmith's son, who was known in the village for his amorous feats, was also never on the farm. Or the blacksmith's son. Early each morning the blacksmith's wife would give me a glass of hot borscht and a piece of stale bread, which, when soaked in the borscht, gained flavor as rapidly as the borscht lost it. Afterwards I would light the fire in my comet and drive the cattle toward the pasture ahead of the other cowherds. In the evening the blacksmith's wife said her prayers. He snored against the oven, the hired hands tended the cattle, and the blacksmith's son prowled the village. The blacksmith's wife would give me her husband's jacket to delouse. I would sit in the brightest spot in the room, folding the jacket at various places along the seams and hunting the white, lazily moving, blood-filled insects. I would pick them out, put them on the table, and crush them with my fingernail. When the lice were exceptionally numerous, the blacksmith's wife would join me at the table and roll a bottle over the lice as soon as I put several of them down. The lice would burst with the crunching sound, their flattened corpses lying in small pools of dark blood. Those that fell onto the dirt floor scurried away in every direction. It was almost impossible to squash them underfoot. The blacksmith's wife did not let me kill all the lice and bedbugs. Whenever we found a particularly large and vigorous louse, she would carefully catch it and throw it into a cup set aside for this purpose. Usually when the number of such lice reached a dozen, the wife would take them out and knead them into a dough. To this she added a little human and horse urine, a large amount of manure, a dead spider, and a pinch of cat excrement. This preparation was considered to be the best medicine for bellyache. When the blacksmith suffered his periodic bellyache, he had to eat several balls of this mixture. Instead of vomiting, and as his wife assured him to the total conquest of the disease which promptly fled his body, exhausted by vomiting and trembling like a reed, the blacksmith would lie on the mat at the foot of the oven and pant like a bellows. He would then be given tepid water and honey which calmed him, but when the pain and fever did not die down, his wife prepared more medicines. She would pulverize horses' bones to fine flour, add a cup of mixed bedbugs and field ants which would start fighting with each other, mix it all with several hens' eggs, and add a dash of kerosene. The patient had to gulp it all down in one big swallow and was then rewarded with a glass of vodka and a piece of sausage. From time to time the blacksmith was visited by mysterious mounted guests who carried rifles and cocked revolvers. They would inspect the house and then sit down at a table with the blacksmith. In the kitchen the blacksmith's wife and I would prepare bottles of home-brewed vodka, strings of spiced hunter's sausage, cheeses, hard-boiled eggs, and sides of roast pork. The armed men were partisans. They came to the village very often without warning. What is more, they fought each other. The blacksmith explained to his wife that the partisans had become divided into factions. The whites, who wanted to fight both the Germans and the Russians, and the reds, who wanted to help the Red Army. Varied rumors circulated in the village. The whites wanted also to retain the private ownership of property, leaving the landlords as they were. The reds, supported by the Soviets, fought for land reform. Each faction demanded increasing assistance from the villages. The white partisans, cooperating with the landlords, took revenge on all who were suspected of helping the Reds. The Reds favored the poor and penalized the villages. For any help they gave to the whites, they especially persecuted the families of the rich peasants. The village was also searched by German troops who interrogated the peasants about the partisan visits and shot 1 or 2 peasants to set an example. In such cases, the blacksmith would hide me in the potato cellar while he himself tried to soften the German commanders, promising them punctual deliveries of foodstuffs and extra grain. Sometimes the partisan factions would attack and kill each other while visiting the village. The village would then become a battlefield. Machine guns roared, grenades burst, huts flamed, abandoned cattle and horses bellowed, and half-naked children howled. The peasants hid in cellars, embracing their praying women, half-blind, deaf, toothless old women babbling prayers and crossing themselves with arthritic hands, walked directly into machine gun fire, cursing the combatants and appealing to heaven for revenge. After the battle, the village would slowly return to life, but there would be fights among the peasants and boys for the weapons, uniforms, and boots abandoned by the partisans, and also arguments about where to bury the dead and who should dig the graves. Days would pass in argument as the corpses decomposed, sniffed by dogs in the daytime and chewed by rats at night. I was awakened one night by the blacksmith's wife, who urged me to flee. I barely had time to leap out of bed before male voices and rattling weapons could be heard surrounding the hut. I hid furtively in the attic with a sack thrown over my body, clinging to a crack in the planks through which I could see a large part of the farm. A firm male voice ordered the blacksmith to come out. 2 armed partisans dragged the half-naked blacksmith into the yard where he stood, shivering from cold and hitching up his falling trousers. In a tall cap with star-spangled epaulets on his shoulders, the leader of the band approached the blacksmith and asked him something. I caught a fragment of a sentence. "You helped enemies of the fatherland." The blacksmith threw up his hands, swearing in the name of the Son and the Holy Trinity. The first blow fouled him. He continued his denials, rising slowly to his feet. One of the men tore out a pole from the fence, swung it through the air, and clouted the blacksmith in the face. The blacksmith fell, and the partisans began to kick him all over with their heavy boots. The blacksmith groaned, writhing with pain, but the men did not stop. They leaned over him, twisting his ears, stepping on his genitals, breaking his fingers with their heels. When he ceased to groan and his body sagged, the partisans hauled out the 2 hired hands, the blacksmith's wife and his struggling son. They opened wide the doors of the barn and threw the woman and the men across the shaft of a cart in such a way that, with the shaft under their bellies, they hung over it like upset sacks of grain. When the partisans tore the clothing off their victims and tied their hands to their feet, they rolled up their sleeves and with steel canes cut from track signal wire began to beat the squirming bodies. The crack of the blows rebounded loudly off the taut buttocks, while the victims twisted, shrinking and swelling and held like a pack of abused dogs. I quivered and sweated with fear. The blows rained one after another. Only the blacksmith's wife continued to wail, while the partisans exchanged witticisms over her lean, crooked thighs. The men struck her heatedly, the rising crescendo of blows slashing the woman's body and belly, now darkened by streams of blood. The bodies on the shaft drooped. The torturers put on their jackets and entered the hut, demolishing the furniture and plundering all in sight. They entered the attic and found me. They held me up by the neck, turning me around, punching me with their fists, pulling me by the hair. They had immediately assumed I was a gypsy foundling. They loudly deliberated what to do with me, then one of them decided I should be delivered up to the German outpost about a dozen miles distant from the hut. According to him, this would make the commander of the outpost less suspicious of the village, which was already tardy in its compulsory deliveries. Another man agreed, adding rapidly that the whole village might be burned down because of a single gypsy bastard. My hands and feet were tied, and I was carried outside. The partisans summoned 2 peasants, to whom they carefully explained something while pointing at me. The peasants listened obediently with obsequious nods. I was placed on a cart and lashed to a crosstie. The peasants climbed onto the box seat and drove off with me. The partisans escorted the cart for several miles, swaying freely in their saddles, sharing food from the village. When we entered the denser part of the forest, they again spoke to the peasants, struck their horses, and vanished in the thicket. Tired by the sun and by my uncomfortable position, I dozed off into half sleep. I dreamed I was a squirrel crouching in a dark tree hole and watching with irony the world below. I suddenly became a grasshopper with long, springy legs on which I sailed across great tracts of land. Now and then, as if through a fog, I heard the voices of the divers. I heard the voices of the drivers, the neighing of the horse, and the squeaking of the wheels. We reached the railroad station at noon and were immediately surrounded by German soldiers in faded uniforms and battered boots. The peasants bowed to them and handed them a note written by the partisans. While the guard went off to call an officer, several officers approached the cart and stared at me, exchanging remarks. One of them, a rather elderly man, clearly fatigued by the heat, was wearing spectacles fogged by steaming droplets of sweat. He leaned against the cart and watched me closely with dispassionate, watery blue eyes. I smiled at him, but he did not respond. I looked straight into his eyes and wondered if this would cast an evil spell on him. I thought he might fall sick, but feeling sorry for him, I dropped my gaze. Remember what he learned from one of the ladies in one of the first chapters? A young officer emerged from the station building and approached the cart. The soldiers quickly straightened their uniforms and stood at attention. The peasants, not quite sure what to do, tried to imitate the soldiers and also drew themselves up servilely. The officer tersely said something to one of the soldiers, who came forward from the file, approached me, patted my bushy hair roughly with his sweaty hand, looked into my eyes while pulling back my lids, and inspected the scars on my knees and calves. He then made his report to the officer. The officer turned to the elderly bespectacled soldier, issued an order, and left. The soldiers moved away from the station building. A gay tune could be heard. From the station building, a gay tune could be heard. On the tall watchtower with its machine gun posts, the guards were adjusting their helmets. The spectacled soldier approached me, wordlessly untied the rope with which I had been tied to the cart, looped one end of the rope on his wrist, and with a movement of his hand ordered me to follow him. I glanced back at the two peasants. They were already on the cart, whipping the horse. We passed the station building. On the way, the soldier stopped at a warehouse where he was handed a small can of gasoline. Then we walked along on the railroad track toward the looming forest. I knew that the soldier had orders to shoot me, pour the gasoline over my body, and burn it. I had seen this happen many times. I remember how the partisans had shot a peasant who was accused of being an informer. In that case, the victim was ordered to dig a ditch into which his body later dropped. I remember the Germans shooting a wounded partisan who was fleeing into the forest, and the tall flame rising later over his dead body. I dreaded pain. The shooting would certainly be very painful, and the burning with gasoline even more so. But I could do nothing. Then the soldier carried a rifle, and the rope tied to my leg was looped over his wrist. I've been reading a lot, so I'm stumbling. Let's try to read slower. I was barefoot, and the cross ties were hot from the sun and scorched my feet. I hopped about on the sharp particles of gravel lying between the cross ties. I tried several times to walk on the trail, but the rope tied to my legs somehow prevented me from keeping my balance. It was difficult to adjust my small steps to the large, measured stride of the soldier. He watched me and smiled faintly at my attempt at acrobatics on the rail. The smile was too brief to signify anything. He was going to kill me. We had already left the station area and now passed the last switch point. It was darkening. We drew nearer to the forest as the sun was setting behind the treetops. The soldier halted, put down the gasoline can, and transferred the rifle to his left arm. He sat down on the edge of the track and, heaving a deep sigh, stretched his legs down the embankment. He calmly took off his spectacles, wiped the sweat from his thick brows with his sleeve, and unclipped the small shovel hanging from his belt. He took out a cigarette from his breast pocket and lit it, carefully extinguishing the match. Silently, he watched my attempt to loosen the rope, which was rubbing the skin off my leg. Then he took a small jackknife out of his trouser pocket, opened it, and moving closer, held my leg with one hand and with the other carefully cut the rope. He rolled it up and flung it over the embankment with a sweeping gesture. I smiled in an attempt to express my gratitude, but he did not smile back. We now sat, he drawing at his cigarette, and I observing the bluish smoke drifting upwards in loops. I began to think of the many ways there were of dying. Until now, only two ways had impressed me. I recalled well the time in the first days of the war when a bomb hit a house across the street from my parents' home. Our windows were blown out. We were assaulted by falling walls, the tremor of the shaken earth, the screams of unknown dying people. I saw the brown surfaces of doors, ceilings, walls, with the pictures still clinging desperately to them, all falling into the void. Like an avalanche rushing to the street came majestic grand pianos, opening and closing their lids in flight, obese, clumsy armchairs, skittering stools, and hassocks. They were chased by chandeliers that were falling apart with shrill cries, by polished kitchen pots, kettles, and sparkling aluminum chamber pots. Pages torn out of gutted books fell down, flapping like flocks of scared birds. Bathtubs tore themselves away slowly and deliberately from their pipes, entwining themselves magically in the knots and scrolls of banisters and railings and rain gutters. As the dust settled, the split house timidly barred its entrails. Limp human bodies lay tossed over the jagged edges of the broken floors and ceilings like rags covering the break. They were just beginning to soak in the red dye. Tiny particles of torn paper, plaster, and paint clung to the sticky red rags like hungry flies. Everything around was still in motion, only the bodies seemed relaxed and at peace. Then came the groans and screams of people pinned down by the falling beams, impaled on rods and pipes, partially torn and crushed under chunks of walls. Only one old woman came up from the dark pit. She clutched desperately at bricks, and when her toothless mouth opened to speak, she was suddenly unable to utter a sound. She was half naked and withered breasts hung from her bony chest. When she reached the end of the crater at the pile of rubble between the pit and the road, she stood up straight for a moment on the ridge. Then she toppled over backwards and disappeared behind the debris. One could die less spectacularly at the hands of another man. Not long ago, when I lived at Lex, two peasants began to fight at a reception. In the middle of the hut, they rushed at each other, clutched at each other's throat, and fell on the dirt floor. They bit with their teeth like enraged dogs, tearing off pieces of clothing and flesh. Their horny hands and knees and shoulders and feet seemed to have a life of their own. They jumped about, clutching, striking, scratching, twisting in a wild dance. Bare knuckles hit skulls like hammers and bones cracked under stress. Then the guests, watching calmly in a circle, heard a crushing noise and a hoarse rattle. One of the men stayed on top longer. The other wheezed and seemed to be weakening, but still lifted his head and spat in the victor's face. The man on top did not forgive this. He triumphantly blew himself up like a bullfrog and took a wide swing, smashing the other's head in with terrible force. The head did not struggle to rise any more, but seemed to dissolve into a growing pool of blood. The man was dead. I felt now like the mangy dog that the partisans had killed. They had first stroked his head and scratched him behind the ears, the dog overwhelmed with joy, yapped with love and gratitude. Then they tossed him a bone. He ran after it, wagging his scruffy tail, scaring the butterflies and trampling flowers. When he seized the bone and proudly lifted it, they shot him. The soldier hitched up his belt. His movement caught my attention, and I stopped thinking for a moment. Then I tried to calculate the distance to the forest and the time it would take him to pick up his rifle and shoot if I should suddenly make a break for it. The forest was too far. I would die midway on the sandy ridge. At best, I might reach the patch of high weeds in which I would still be visible and unable to run fast. The soldier rose and stretched with a groan. Silence surrounded us. The soft wind blew away the smell of the gasoline and brought back a fragrance of marjoram and fir resin. He could, of course, shoot me from the back, I thought. People prefer killing a person without looking into his eyes. The soldier turned toward me and, pointing to the forest, made a gesture with his hand which seemed to say, "Run away, be off." So the end was coming. I pretended I did not understand and approached him. He moved back violently as if fearing that I might touch him, and angrily pointed to the forest, shielding his eyes with his other hand. I thought that this was a clever way of tricking me. He was pretending not to look. I stood rooted to the spot. He glanced at me impatiently and said something in his rough tongue. I smiled fawningly at him, but this only exasperated him more. Again he thrust his arm toward the forest. Again I did not move. Then he lay down between the rails on his rifle from which he had removed the belt. I calculated the distance once more. It seemed to me that this time the risk was small. As I began to move away, the soldier smiled affably for the first time. When I reached the edge of the embankment, I glanced back. He was still lying motionless, dozing in the warm sun. I hastily waved and then leaped like a hare down the embankment, straight into the undergrowth of the cool, shady forest. I tore my skin against the ferns as I fled farther and farther until I finally lost my breath and fell down into the moist, soothing moss. While I lay listening to the sounds of the forest, I heard 2 shots from the direction of the railroad track. Apparently the soldier was simulating my execution. Birds awakened and began rustling in the foliage. Right next to me, a small lizard leaped out of a root and stared attentively at me. I could have squashed it with a whack of my hand, but I was too tired. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too cold of a man, but maybe because I know now that this book is it's fiction. It's not a real story. Maybe I don't really like this story anymore. I don't know. I read pretty fast. I know this chapter was fast, but I was trying to get it over with. Anyway, yeah. Anyway.